Hi, and welcome to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. Thank you for checking out our podcast. Established in 1935, we're an American-owned and family-owned independent seed company. And we're excited to partner with you in our new podcast by bringing you 5 generations of agricultural experience and decades of industry expertise. In our podcasts, you can expect to gain valuable and timely information to aid you in making decisions for your operation. We'll keep things simple and informative, and much like our motto, Planet Profit. Welcome back to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. As always, this is Juan, and I'm joined by Craig Alleman, our lead agronomist. And in this episode, we're going to discuss the best time to scout for corn and soybean emergence, and how to keep an eye on it, and why it's important to do so. We'll also talk about the impact of planting dates and the depths on emergence, and how it relates to growing degree units. Additionally, we're also going to cover recent hail events that came across central Iowa and their effects on the emerged crops, including how to identify injuries and what could lead to bacterial disease. But anyways, welcome, Craig.
Hey, good morning, Juan.
Good morning. How and also welcome back to the neck of the woods. I know you just got back from Wyoming and seeing your son graduate college. That must be pretty neat.
Yeah, it's a great experience. Number two down and 1 to go. So,
and that's not there yet, and I'm not looking forward to it. So
it's expensive.
well, well, in your travels back, and I'm sure you've either gotten a lot of calls on just either seed that's emerged or hasn't emerged, but and you've probably been done. Your operation's down in Warren County, Illinois. I think you've been done for 10 days or so, maybe.
Yeah, we finished up that last window or the first week in May. There, we had just a couple days left. We got an early start down here that day right after Easter, which was April the 10th. There was a lot of activity right in my area. We had good temps, great soil conditions, and had about 5 days there. We took advantage and we got all our beans done in that window and got good start on the corn. And then the following week, Wednesday, I think the following week, really, we only felt like we had 1 day there, that the temps were good enough that we didn't have to worry about imbibitional chilling. And so we got a little more done, and that just left a couple days this last window. And, of course, emergence was much slower on some of that earlier planted stuff. It turned off colder than expected even. And we did have some beans cracking the ground on that April 19th. So they would have went in the 10th, 9 days. That's not bad at all on emergence. Went through a couple of days or a couple of those nights where we had 30-degree temps, and we, based on experience, weren't too worried. Beans will, they produce a substance that acts kind of like an antifreeze. They can take temps. I always use the rule of thumb 28 degrees for 4 hours, but it's somewhere between 28 and 30 degrees for several hours before you really have to worry about them. And they came through with flying colors, so that kind of proved itself again. And then this latest window where we planted that first week in May, and I would say that's where the lion's share of the crops went in our footprint. There's crops out of the ground in 5-6 days, so warmer temps, quicker emergence. We saw that last year on a large scale when we had a delayed planting. Boded well for yield. When you get through the ground that quickly, you get away from a lot of those soil-borne fungal diseases. Although the earlier planted stuff that I went back and looked at now, just out yesterday digging some corn and looking at it, it looks like our stuff anyway that I was looking at, the roots look great. I didn't see any discoloration. Of course, we went to Viantis a couple of years ago and we're protecting against Pythium, which is probably the biggest one we would get under cool, wet conditions and slow emergence. And so it looks good. So I think all of our planting windows so far, with a few exceptions where we had heavy pounding rains, things like that always make it difficult for emergence. Looks like emergence is pretty good over our footprint.
Well, that's good there. Would you? I mean, in my neck of the woods, and at least, I drive up to the office up in Jackson County, and I drove up from the Quad Cities, and yeah, you're right. I don't see a whole lot of planters going anymore. It seems like either folks are wrapped up or wrapping up. Now our neighbors up north are a little bit different story. But what you and I were talking, I think it was yesterday, and you mentioned a recent call you got about some emerged corn that there was there was a corn on corn situation, and can you talk a little bit about that, kind of what that call was about and what you saw and
Yeah, anybody that has grown continuous corn knows that there's always we call it the ugly stage that you go through, um, and that could be yellowing of the corn, and usually it's patchy and just it's just ugly. And so that's kind of what I was looking at there yesterday. That had a good stand. This corn went in that week after April, but there were definitely streaks, where it was very yellow and versus streaks that looked just fine. And when when we were digging out there, went to the yellow stuff first, and as I carefully kind of dug down through to see what I was going to look at. I mean, anytime you see an above ground issue with any crop, but discoloration or whatever it may be, my first thing that I want to do is see what is going on underneath the surface, what's going on with the roots. So we're looking for things like compaction and different things at that point in time, because your above ground symptoms usually something that, due to something that's going on underneath the surface. You could have, pancake roots with soybeans that are just growing flat, and you might see a potash deficiency on the leaf, for instance. Well, it's not that the soil's potash deficient, it's that the roots aren't getting to the potash. So as I was digging down there yesterday, first in that yellow stuff, I was just getting a really heavy amount of residue that I was digging through, and the customer had done a great job managing their residue. I mean, they had it sized down really small. They really couldn't do much better. But when you run these combines, and you run a ripper through after you ran a combine, it's not going to do a perfect job of spreading that residue out. There's always going to be some heavy areas, and that ripper's just not going to get rid of it all. And I'm sure that's what we were seeing in those streaked areas, heavy residue right behind the combine that didn't get completely spread out, and then that corn was trying to grow up through that. And the issue there is, the yellowing is going to be a nitrogen deficiency, is what we're seeing. And the microbes that are breaking down that residue are using the nitrogen as a food source. So the nitrogen that's sitting there available to that plant, they're using a lot of it, to help them break down that residue, and then eventually that'll be released back out, and the corn roots will grow down through that residue and get to other, available nitrogen, and then they'll green back up and get through that, what we call that ugly stage. So wasn't really anything wrong. My what I was really after is the health of the roots, and the roots were very white. There was no brown discoloration or anything that we would see with like a Pythium or Rhizoctonia or Fusarium, any of the water molds that we see this time of the year, the soil-borne fungal diseases. So that, my estimation to the customer was that you don't have any damage here. It's going to grow through this, and your roots are very healthy, and I don't really see a yield penalty usually with that um, kind of a symptom that we see out there this time of the year.
okay. Well, Nate, I appreciate that. I thought that was pretty interesting, probably helpful for folks to listen to. Um, Looking at my podcast notes here, and I'm kind of jumped around a little bit, and I may have gotten ahead of GDUs. I've seen it as it's known as growing degree units, or GDDs, growing degree days. How can we how can we use that as a tool uh, to evaluate or kind of keep an eye on uh, when when you merge, and what can we do with that information?
Yeah, well, GDUs or growing degree units or growing degree days. I mean, same thing. It's just what different people have called them through the years, but it's just a temperature. I mean, we're just a way to measure temperature and then relate that back to how the crop is developing, or maybe when an insect hatches. There's a lot of different ways that we apply that. Um, Again, it just puts a little science behind the time span. So we know corn can emerge like this last planting window. It can emerge in 5 days, because the temperatures are warmer. And then that stuff we planted earlier might be 3 weeks, before it comes out of the ground. And that's based on, again, on temperature. So with growing, to calculate that, we use you take the high plus the low of the day, divide that by 2 and subtract 50. That's just the simple calculation. Now, the high, they stop at 86. Basically what they're saying is that above 86 degrees, and that crop's not going to grow any faster, maybe slow down. And then below 50, the same thing. The crop's really not going to be growing. If we get below 50, it's going to shut down. So that gives us a growing degree units per day, or growing degree days. And that's what we use then to determine. We know then it takes X growing degree days to get corn to emerge, or when we've had X growing degree days, um, in the since the season has started, that may be when the rootworm larva will hatch out. Okay, so and some of us know when the fireflies start flying, that's about the time frame that the rootworm larvae come out. Well, fireflies hatch and come out in a certain amount of growing degree days. So it's just a little bit of a scientific method to kind of determine when we're going to hit certain growth stage.
Okay. And so um, I was talking to one of the district sales managers, and he kind of wanted you to also touch base on um, also just touching base on like how your planting depth, will also how that ties into emergence. There'll be some folks that might be a little drier and may have gotten deeper to chase some of that moisture, and probably expected to be out sooner. How does that tie into all that?
Yeah, and that's a really really good question. Now with corn, and again, everybody has their own personal favorite depth that they like to plant. But generally speaking, with corn, that 2 inches is a good depth to try to hit. I personally, on a normal year where I've got adequate moisture at that depth, because that's important. You got to chase that moisture. If you don't want to set that seed out there in dry dirt, because you don't know when you're going to get the rain and get it to come out of the ground. So you want to get it placed in good moisture, and not just barely in moisture, because that layer may dry and move down on you before it soaks up enough water to germinate. So you want to get it in decent moisture. I shoot for 2 1/4. I think anywhere from that 2 to 2 3/4, 3 inches is a good depth. But I shoot for 2 1/4 because I want to, even after that soil has settled down after that first rain, I still want to be a couple inches deep. And so that's just my personal opinion on it. But you are going to get, if you think about it, you're going to get a much more consistent temperature if you get it, down at a deeper depth. Some guys will go 1.5 inches. I think that's really, you're getting borderline on if you're deep enough. You do need to get deep enough to where your nodal roots, when they begin to set, they're a little bit deeper and can anchor that plant down. If you get too shallow, I've seen accidental planting at like 3/4 of an inch, and you can get what's called a shallow root syndrome. Those nodal roots, when they start coming out, are going to be, basically at the surface, and if they won't grow in dry soil. So if we get you know, dry, warm winds and bake that upper surface, those nodal roots just aren't going to grow, and then they're not going to anchor that plant. And that primary root system is not very deep to be able to help anchor that plant. So, those are some of the things we worry about. But in earlier planting, probably the question is that planting depth, and make sure you get a consistent temperature, and that is really important on some of that earlier planting. You get it. University of Minnesota has done studies years and years ago. Of course, up there where it's much colder, and that deeper depth on earlier planting to get that consistent temperature, is pretty important for emerging evenly. So I think that's kind of the root of that question.
Okay, no, definitely. So I want to touch base on replant. I'm kind of we'll circle back to it again specifically, but let's say for whatever reason someone's in a replant situation right now, and they're planting again. Now we're later in the season. Are they going to want to go shallower planting depth to get out sooner, or is it a case by case and soil by soil kind of situation?
No, your planting depth should not change. That wanting to make sure you get into moisture, wanting to make sure you have a consistent, temperature so that you emerge evenly, making sure that when those nodal roots come out on corn, they're a little bit deeper and are going to anchor better and be in moisture. Those things won't change depending on your planting date. So
Okay.
that depth is something that I certainly wouldn't change. And when we started, um, we've had a lot of wind. It's just been windier than normal this spring in Western Illinois, and our surface was really dry. So we chased moisture. So I started out at that 2.25 inch planting depth, and right away, we that pause and pause that planter and get out and dig and
Dig and
yeah, yeah.
We butchered that last time on the last episode, by the
You
way.
you,
I
you did.
oh
Okay.
yeah. I caught an earful from Janie, in marketing. She said, "Hey, you don't want to do that." And
Well,
I we joke about it, but sometimes and I know folks will see it in every industry. You'll come up with some catchy to hopefully make it memorable, and our goal behind that is it's really important, right? So that pausing and digging and measuring just to check that depth. But sorry, interrupt you there. That's funny. You reminded me about that.
I suppose we have to have marketing people.
Yeah.
But
Right. That's funny.
um, yeah. So, but anyway, I had my 2.25 inch depth, the planter set there, but we got down and after the end rows and that first pass, so you're into the field conditions. Did some digging and I was in moisture, but I was barely in moisture. So we probably started out 2.5, 2 3/4 inch is what we were planting depth on corn, and on beans, inch and a half on beans is plenty good. Inch to inch and a half, depending on moisture. And we were probably the same way with beans. We were probably 2.5 inches deep, and so
Oh,
you got to
nice.
make sure that you're in that moisture.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. So I kind of jumped ahead of it when I mentioned replant earlier, but oh boy, I'd say about a week ago, I think it was, because today's what, May 17th. So it was about a week ago. We had some storm cells. Oh, it was last weekend. Move across kind of that central Iowa and move eastward. And I know we had um, several growers and some seed reps that had just giant hail, right? You had that softball size hail that is just there's no question it demolished it, and it's need to be replanted. And there was some folks that had the little smaller hail, and I vaguely remember, I don't know what year it was, and you kind of just talking about how an abrasion on the plant it can be a vector for disease. It's kind of like just tissue. It's kind of like if we get cut and staying clean and whatnot. Let's talk a little bit about those hail events, and then tying that into, I think it's an easier decision to decide whether or not you replant there. But I also kind of want to touch base on the folks that may have been affected by the cold spell, and how long they should wait as they're evaluating whether or not they should replant. I said a
Yeah,
lot there.
yeah. Oh, and I'll kind of probably walk that around in a circle. It's a good question on replant in general, and we'll kind of bring the hail into it as well, because I know I talked with Dave Struthers. Dave is out there at Collins, Iowa, and east of Des Moines, and he had this issue both on some soybeans and some hay. Some newly seeded hay. Um, and I'm thinking has replanted both of those in our conversations. But replant in general, normally when we get hail, it's later in the year, so it's not usually a replant situation for hail. You're gonna kind of evaluating as to what you're gonna expect for yield. But this time of the year, of course, it can be a replant situation. And when we go out there and we think about replant in general, we're really looking at planting dates. So, what was the planting date, the initial planting date of the field? And then, if we did replant, what can the expected yield be? Now, I carry around, Purdue has a corn soybean guide. I carry that around with me. Iowa State, Purdue's is combined in one. Iowa State has one for corn, one for beans. University of Wisconsin has some really good material on replant soybeans in particular that Sean Conley has worked with, and so any of those things can be good references. But I got my Iowa State book sitting here on my desk open, and for instance, they're saying that 100% yield potential on corn is 35,000 plants planted between April 20th and May 5th. So, that's their studies over time. In the state of Iowa, that's your magic window for planting corn, and that's your magic population range according to Iowa State. But if we were sitting here today, let's say we had a 20,000 plant stand. So if that 20,000 plants were planted in that magical window of April 20th to May 5th, that's still an 89% yield potential. All right. So if we have a field that is in question and we're thinking about replanting it today, if we go back and plant that 35,000, which they're saying is the best uh, population range, if we planted that after May 15th, or so in their window, it's a May 15th to May 25th. They're saying 35,000 plants is an 87% yield potential. So if we have 20 planted in the earlier window, we've got 2% more yield potential than if we tore it up and replanted it today. So those are the decisions that we make. Now, I I looked at some corn that was planted, county south of here, down around Macomb, Illinois. That was planted that week after Easter. They had some real heavy rains on that, and they had some heavy hail along with it, and just really crusted the ground. And this customer ended up replanting 4 or 5 fields in that area. When they got away from that heavy rain, where they had just like 3 to 5 tenths out of that storm, no issues. They had good emergence, but they were replanting. That end of April, 1st of May. So they were replanting still in the 100% yield potential window, because the initial planting was early, and they had that kind of a time. But if you're looking at it today, you really got to study am I doing the right thing by replanting? Am I going to gain yield, or am I going to spend additional inputs and not gain anything, or maybe lose? So,
Okay. Well, like you said, you've said this lots of times, is every operation is different and everybody's got different input costs. So, at the end of the day, it's that individual decision, but just making sure you kind of evaluate some of those studies and even your own personal past experience, to help you make that decision. And I know,
I, and I didn't really get back to the hail issue. So, with the hail issue, later in the season, as you talk, we worry about wounds that we're putting on the stalk or things like that. And is that going to allow, gray leaf spot to get in or something like that? But, at this time of the year, we're just looking to see if those soybeans are actually going to survive and going to produce a plant. And, I was talking to Dave. I said, well, you need to get down there and see if there's anything left at that cotyledon node. Because we know from experience, a couple years ago, we had that freeze on Memorial Day weekend, and we froze some of those beans off, but they were able to initiate the axillary buds right there where the cotyledons are attached, and when that happens, you've got nearly 100% yield potential. The axillary buds are at every node, and they won't become active unless something is injured on the upper growth on that soybean plant. But when they activate, you'll have basically two stems that come out there, and one will eventually become the dominant stem, and it will look like a normal plant. So there is some hope sometimes with soybeans. Corn that's hailed off this time of the year, of course, the growing point is underneath the ground. It'll just come right back. I mean, the primary root system and the seed are its source of food this time of the year, and it'll continue to stick new leaves out, and so it recovers through something like that at the early stage even better than soybeans.
Oh, well, that's interesting. As everyone knows, there's different stages that the corn or soybeans are in right now in terms of emergence. But in general, for the most part, for the folks that took advantage of that great window earlier this month, what is the best time to start scouting, and what should growers be looking for specifically?
Well, there's always opportunities to scout all year long. Just depends on what you're looking for. The corn that I was in yesterday, it was planted that week after Easter there. That's already at V3. So we've got 3 collared leaves on that plant. First leaf that comes out, it'll have a rounded tip. So that's how you always tell that if that leaf is still there, but eventually sometimes it'll dry up. But and then the leaves after that will have a pointed tip. So when at the base where that leaf attaches to the stalk, not really attaches, but because it'll attach lower, and there'll be part of that sheath that'll wrap around the stalk. But where that leaf comes to the stalk, you're going to be able to see a line, when that is at a growth stage. So you don't count the number of leaves that are out, you count the leaves that are showing that color right down there at the sheath, and that determines what growth stage you're in. So, that's V3 corn when we have 3 collars visible. And then on the soybeans, some of the early planted soybeans, before I took off to Wyoming, so I was out, I think, on Thursday of last week, looking at some bean fields on a 4-wheeler. And, we were pretty close to that V1 stage then. And, now, so a V1 stage on soybeans, that means that first trifoliate that's coming out. So you have the cotyledons, of course, which basically are the seed. And then the first leaves that actually come out on a soybean plant are just single leaves. So we call those the unifoliate. So when the unifoliates are out and you've got the cotyledons there, that's the VC stage. Your first V1 stage is when that first set of trifoliates come out and they no longer touch each other. So the leaves aren't completely unfurled yet, but they're not touching each other, and that designates the next V stage. So those soybeans were awful close to V1 before I left, and then I looked there yesterday, and the first trifolia is completely unfurled, and so we're getting pretty close to V2 with them. Now, in soybeans, the magical part of that on early planting soybeans is if we hit V3 soybeans, kind of that week ahead of summer solstice, which is June 21st, that's when we trigger that early flowering, and that's the early flowering is the whole key to early planting soybeans, and getting more nodes out there eventually, and more beans. So we're really on track with that. That early window to. We'll be blown way past V3 by the time that time frame gets here. So that's exciting. I saw V3 last year on June the 1st, and we'll probably top that, I think, this year on some of the early planted stuff.
Oh my, well that'll be neat. And I think on the field you're talking about, you're checking, is that the one that we're kind of following and we've been tweeting and putting out on social media?
Yeah, that's the one I always go back to use as my barometer. But that's 2136 E's and planted there at Little York, Illinois.
3.6 enlist bean. Okay.
Warren. Yep. Yep. So that's the one I've just kind of been following. That was planted on the 10th of April. First day we got going. It was first field we planted. So just kind of been keeping track of that and try to snap a picture at the same spot. But those guys are rocking and rolling right now.
Well, that's awesome. Let me know when it gets to a point where I need to go out there and fly the drone to get a different picture. I'm always looking for a reason, especially if the weather's right.
Or run the combine on them, right?
Hey, I tell you what, absolutely.
You're on.
I've as for an IT guy in the industry, and pretty fortunate on those opportunities of help put in the plots up at the office. And I know up today we're putting in the nursery, the research nursery that Chuck Cornelius handles and takes care of. Sam and Chris.
Don't be messing up on the nursery. By the
way. They needed attention to detail, and they know I'm the guy for that. So so on corn, it sounds like for the most part, the folks that are at V3 stage or getting to V3 soon, they can be scouting for insect damage, right? And uh, are we talking like, you look at root, you look for rootworm issues or leaf feeding, corn borers?
I mean, when you're scouting a crop in general, you're looking for issues. I mean, you may be looking at this time of the year emergence issues. You may be looking uh, discoloration, and again, when you see discoloration, you need to get down there and dig the roots and see if you've got what kind of an issue you might have. We'll start seeing. Oh, you might start seeing some yellowing spots. Stunted corn might be a grape collapsus, feeding on the roots. But cutworm is big at this time of the year, and we have had some cutworm flights. Iowa State does a trap moth monitoring traps across the state, and they send alerts out. In alfalfa, we've had pretty heavy alfalfa weevils. We sprayed Saturday last week. We weren't ready to cut and had rain in the forecast, so we had to go ahead and call planes in and spray. Had some real heavy alfalfa weevil damage. Also, it's usually end of May, 1st of June, based on growing degree units. But when you see those fireflies coming out at night, that's generally when our rootworm larvae are hatching. So they're going to start feeding. So mid-June's a good time frame to dig some roots and see how your rootworm prevention program is working, really. So you're trying to see how heavy a feeding you have out there, see if your insecticide's working, or see if your traded corn is working. May give you an idea if you're going to need to throw a insecticide in with your fungicide at that R1 stage to prevent silk clipping and things like that. But always scouting is just, you need to be prepared for anything you see out there, and you're just looking for problems. I mean, you might be looking for spacing, emergence, evenness of your emergence, see if you have a planter issue, that way, making sure all your rows are even, things like that. Trace that back to something you can improve for next year. But you kind of go out there with an open mind and look for just any issues that you might have.
Well, that's a good point. I like it, tying it back to that. As you know, there's some of them where there's not a whole lot you can do, right? If you had some skips here or there and whatnot, um, but you could, like you said, you can take those opportunities as how can you address the equipment and what improvements you can make. That some of them are just a tweak here or there and some elbow grease, right? That that may not require a whole lot of investment. The boy, I feel like we've definitely covered a lot on this podcast. Is there anything that we missed that you want to make sure we highlight to the next one?
I think we covered it pretty good. Everything that we're trying to do this time of the year. So,
And what would you say, just from everything we talked about, are just a couple big takeaways that you want to make sure folks leave off remembering?
well, I always there's always big times of the year that I look and see what our growing conditions are as kind of an indicator of what kind of a crop we might have. And the first one is emergence. And as I mentioned, and there's always exceptions. So I don't want to make this a general rule, but we were pretty particular in trying to be a little bit out front there on these earlier planting windows. We sent out an alert on that first one, recommended corn planters shut down at dark on Friday of that week after Easter, and then soybeans based on temps and what we know about soybeans. I think noon on the next following day on Saturday. That was our recommendation. And then we did have a window the Wednesday of the next week in some of the southern geographies that was good, but we recommended shutting it down. Um, from then on, because the temps were getting cold again. We're wanting to stay away from imbibitional chilling, and particularly in corn. And so as I've looked at this crop that has emerged, it looks like those were good calls. That early planting window, we had pretty darn good emergence. That next week was good. And then, of course, this last window when the bulk of the crop got planted was just excellent, coming out of the ground in 5-6 days is a great thing. So, and I guess my takeaway is that it looks like we're off to a pretty good start again. So, last year we knew we were off to a good start, even though it was a little bit delayed, and we ended up having a big crop, in our footprint. I would say we're off to a good start. So we move on to the next stage, and that's kind of that V5 when we start determining rows around, and then shoulder high V12 when we do length of the row, and then we move into the tasseling time frame will be our next big one, and then just finish it off with grain fill, of course. So far so good. We got a long ways to go, and that always moisture is probably our biggest thing. So looks like maybe we're getting out of those droughty situations. I'm sure there's still pockets, but even out western Iowa, we've been getting some rains here of recent, and so hopefully it's going to be a nice normal moisture year, and temps will be normal, and we'll have a good growing season.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more there, Craig. Um, well, thank you for listening, and anyone, and also if you check us out on our social media channels. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. That's the ones we're dabbling in now, and each one shares something a little different. You either look up Cornelius Seed or the Planet Profit, at Planet Profit. Uh, you can see updates from Craig and agronomic tips, and or just some really cool, pretty pictures from the field. So, again, thank you, everyone, and until the next one.